Hello, good morning. My name is Emeko Kereke, and this is Nkata Podcast, Dots of Thoughts. This is one of the shows running on my podcast platform, Nkata Podcast Station. And so the idea behind this show, or rather, how I had conceived it in the beginning, was simply to use it as a space to articulate some of my thoughts. Thoughts that I come across spontaneously as a result of coincidences and synchronicities, but also thoughts that I wake up to in the morning. This show is called Dots of Thoughts, right? But then I woke up this morning thinking, what is thought? And what is the function of thought in our everyday lives, in our reality? You see, I live in the West, precisely in Berlin, in Germany. And I've been here for quite some time, living my life here, although I travel a lot. In fact, so much that I have been to most continents of the world and have traveled across countries extensively. I am from Africa, Nigeria, to be precise. In my language, the Igbo language of the people of the east of Nigeria, there is so much reference to communality, relationality, but also the notion that life is experiential, is a visceral experience, but also is a journey of uncertainty. That in and of itself is what life is. But I've come to realize that in the West, thought is foundational to human experience. And so I've been thinking about that. To what extent has thought played a role in the shaping of reality, in how human beings understand what it means to be human? The dreams, the aspirations, the relationship between people, objects, our environment, the world at large. And it got me thinking about the concept proposed by a 17th century French philosopher, René Descartes. I think, therefore I am. I think, therefore I am. So if you're listening to this podcast and you don't know who René Descartes is, I would invite you to just do a very quick Google search to understand where I'm going. Now, this concept was proposed in his then seminal work, Discourse on Method, that was put out exactly in 1637. And by this time, by 1637, the age of discovery had already brought European powers, especially Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, France, and even England, into deep contact and conflict with the Americas, Africa, and parts of Asia. Colonization was in full swing, The Dutch had established the Dutch East India Company and were asserting dominance in trade and conquest. The 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, a brutal religious and political conflict across Europe, was reshaping power dynamics internally. In this crucible, rationalism emerged as a new response to the chaos and uncertainty of the times. The world order, rooted in scholasticism, Aristotelianism, and religious authority, was cracking. Descartes' work symbolized a new foundation based not on tradition, revelation, or feudal structure, but on individual reason. And this is the point here, on individual reason. That assertion, I think, therefore I am, was an attempt to rein in the uncertainty, the idea that we do not know what will happen as Europe continues to expand and discover the world. Again, the new age of discovery. It was important to come up with framework. Again, it is discourse on method. That is the title, that is the literal title of the work of Rene Descartes, out of which this concept, I think, therefore I am, came to be. So it was a work that had at its root the need to come up with a methodology for how the Western person can structure reality around a certain logic that is beneficial, that sort of like points all the currents back to that Western person. That is to say, that puts the Western person on the right side, both of history, and that is the past, the present, and even the future. It was a work of reining in reality and saying that we are going to take this uncertainty and bring it, rein it in completely, and construct. It's a work of constructing certainty out of uncertainty. But as you know, that can only be a process of giving structural integrity to an illusion. And that became the foundation of the human experience from the Western person's point of view. But for that to actually be a thing, for that to be something that is sustainable, whether it is in the short term or in the long run, it has to be consistent. It has to be mechanistic. It has to be systemic. So all of that followed. Of course, the rest, as we say, is history, because from then on, it was about constructing the mechanisms, the doctrines, the institutions, the systems, the machineries, the technology for reinforcing that illusion of the structural integrity of thought. Thought, this thing that is not consistent in any way, became consistent. This thing that has no continuity, and I will come to that really in depthly, now carried within it the illusion of continuity, you see. But then, as time goes on, the Western person, and of course, in all other parts of the world where that notion was transported to, Africa, Latin America, the Caribbeans, Asia, everywhere that idea of the world based on I think, therefore I am was transported to. It caught on. So we started shaping the world around the illusion of the continuity of thought. But thought has no continuity. And this is something that, fast forward to the 20th century, we have the Indian spiritual teacher and philosopher, even though he will be the first to deny all of those labels. But I'm speaking of Jiddu Krishnamurti. So again, if you don't know Jiddu Krishnamurti, I invite you to do a bit of research on Google and to get to know a little bit about him, but also to follow the trail that you find of his work. But Jiddu Krishnamurti was the philosopher who, in my opinion, took on this question of thought head on. And I might even say, or we might even say, that all of his life work is based on showing us how we are trapped in the grip of thought. In fact, to him, thought is the origin of conflict. Thought is the origin of suffering. Then, the big proposal he made was to ask, is it possible for thought to end? And in all his lectures, because that is what he did, he didn't write books, he didn't believe in that, but he gave lectures upon lectures, which were recorded, and today we see a lot of them on YouTube. So I encourage you to check them out for yourself and listen to him. There is a foundation that has been set up around his work that you will find on YouTube. But I think 2 books have been written or has been compiled about his work. One of which is called The First and Last Freedom. J. Krishnamurti made a proposal. In fact, to him, thought is old. Thought is about form. It is not there is no newness in thought. If you are engrossed in thought, then you are constantly dealing with the old. This is not to say that there is no place for thought. In fact, thought is important and very necessary only if you can see for yourself the limitation of thought. And personally for me, it has become this, that thought has limit because it is something that is context specific, always within a certain context. It always has a moment of decay, a moment of dissolution, a moment where it becomes irrelevant. In other words, there is no continuity in thought the way we have been made to believe. Because thought is something that is about form. It is something that we construct. It is something that we make. It also has a moment of dissolution. And because of that, it always has a limit. It is context specific. In other words, there is something else beyond thought. You see, there is something else beyond thought. So what is thought for me? Thought is a tool, is an object for making correlations, Thought is for pattern recognition. It's for putting things in relation. It is a tool. That is the reason why much of what we have created, or would I say made, the objects, the inventions, they are all within the domain of thought. And it's important that we understand that regardless of how lofty, how important we assume these things to be, that they have a moment where they become obsolete, irrelevant. Do you understand? And that is not in itself something that is wrong. It is supposed to be that way because thought is within the confines of physicality. And everything that is within the confines of physicality has a moment of decay. And that is what life is. Look around you. You know, the flowers and the plants that you see all fresh and green will one day wither and fall on the ground, and a new one will grow. It is a law that whatever that has within it the limitations of physical reality has a moment of dissolution, of renewal, of death. And so thought is not as continuous as we have been made to believe. That's one. Okay. Thought is only there to make correlations. And if we understand this, then we understand that thought is a tool that allows us to enter into relation with each other, but it is not who we are. You are not your thought, but the thinker can become the thought. And that is a trap. You see, the thing is this. This might sound like a contradiction or a paradox that we are not our thought. Yet, at the same time, the thinker is the thought. And that is true. You become what you think only if you buy into the idea that the foundation of your experience of reality is through thinking. Again, we go full circle back to that proposal by Rene Descartes. I think, therefore I am. We have already said that the reason why it was necessary for Descartes to come up with that concept was a time when Europe was looking to basically tame reality with all the uncertainties, with all the upheavals, both internally and externally. It was a time of global conquest by the West. But at the same time, it was a period of internal turmoil. So there had to be a way to construct reality so that you can rein in all of those uncertainty. But today, we are in crisis. And that crisis is a modern crisis. But it is a crisis of perception. It's as if we are trapped in the thick wax of thought. I use the analogy wax because you see, growing up, my dad owned a candle manufacturing company. And all through my time growing up, I experienced all the process of candle making. I, in fact, at some point, worked in the factory as well. So when I'm using this analogy, wax, it is not only on the conceptual level or intellectual level, it's on the experiential, in the sense that I have seen for myself how the candle wax can trap something inside of it. And if there is no movement whatsoever, it will stay trapped inside that wax until there is some form of movement, either brought about by heat to melt the wax so that it can free what's inside of it. And it seems to me that that is the conundrum that we are facing on an ontological level, on an existential level. This idea that thought is the foundation. So we have thinking people, people who are constantly caught up with thinking. But you see, the thing is this: when our life is about thinking, and again, this is something that I've experienced both in myself, having lived and been moving around in the West for over 2 decades now, but also with my friends, my colleagues, you realize that the way life is in the Western world. But again, when I say Western world, I'm not limiting to that. It's also now happening in other places as well, in Africa, in Asia, in fact, in the world in general. That thinking has become a way of experiencing reality. And so, one of the greatest challenges that we have is, how to go beyond thought. And even in therapy, you find that some of the greatest challenges is how to, you know, get one not to be an overthinker, you see. And oftentimes I have friends and colleagues say, I think too much. And we know this, right? Thinking too much, overthinking this, here and there. But you realize that the one who is always thinking is also afraid. They have anxiety and fear. Thinking or overthinking is almost synonymous with anxiety, existential fear, almost to the point of neurosis. But why is that? What exactly is one afraid of when they are thinking? I've come to realize that perhaps it is because thought has an end, has a moment of expiration, a moment of death, that thought is not continuous as we have been made to believe. Perhaps what the thinker is afraid of is this moment of expiration, moment of dissolution of thought. Because now you understand, as we have said before, that the thinker becomes thought. And if thought has a moment of expiration, of death, then the thinker, who is now the thought, is aware somewhere of this death, of this expiration, of this end of thought. And so, this certain awareness that is a function of thinking, but also of thought, now manifest as a form of anxiety that one cannot place their finger on, but is still the work of thought. This is the main reflection that I came up with this morning. But how do we begin to address this? Now, by the way, I want to say that all of this that I'm saying now is nothing new. If you also look at the work of J. Krishnamurti, you will find all of this, where he tells you that the whole business of thought is that you are dealing with the old, you are dealing with form. And because you are always dealing with form, which is what thought is, there is always, at the flip side of it, the anxiousness towards formlessness, the anxiety towards uncertainty, the fear of a life with no guarantee. And all of that is the work of thought when one is subsumed and trapped in thought. When one have bought into the idea that I think, therefore I am. That is to say, to confirm my existence is to hold on to the fact that I am thinking. And this is something that Descartes also expounded on. The whole idea, the premise of that is that the evidence that you can doubt things, that you can create many what ifs within a situation, is a testament or an evidence of your own existence. The fact that you can even doubt, the fact that you can take one situation and create multiple scenarios of it and create a dichotomy, a sort of dualism, the object and the subject, the self and the other, all of that, the fact that you can do that within the domain of thought is a testament, is an evidence of your existence. That is the legacy of the work of Rene Descartes. And it has now become our trap. We are now looking for a way to go beyond that. It has become a crisis of perception. Because today, a lot of people of this time and of the younger generation are looking for a way to, get back to this place where one can go beyond thought. They sense it. They sense the limitation of thinking. That is why it is one of the most discussed situation or issues in therapy. And also, we are now talking about emotional intelligence, vulnerability, and all of that. But the problem, or rather the conundrum, is that because we are deeply trapped, caught in this wax of thought, we are still trying to get to this place of freeing ourselves from thought through thought. So we are overthinking what it means, emotional intelligence. We are overthinking what vulnerability is. We are constructing formulas for meditation and for mindfulness and all of that. We are still doing that through thought. And again, this is something that J. Krishnamurti had addressed many years ago already. In fact, his work was about getting us to see that we are trapped in thought, but also to get us to enter the process of freeing ourselves from thought, from the grip of thought through our own process. Now, for me personally, what is the answer? Well, where I am now is this. There is a place beyond thought. It is a still point. It is presence. And I say this not lightly because I've always sensed this even since childhood. And there used to be a time in my life around when I was becoming a teenager where I found myself, thrust into life, where I had to, understand life on my own, navigate it my own way. I always think back to those moments. And something always comes back to me. There is a part of who I am that feels like ever present. And I know that we might say that change is the only constant, that everything changes. So it will feel like a paradox or a contradiction when I say, I have always known that there is a part of me that is ever present as if it never changes. But I'll get into this idea of the part of one that doesn't change in subsequent episodes of this podcast. But today I want to talk about that presence. For me, that presence is a presence that absents nothing. Let me say that again. It is a presence that absents nothing. It does not absent anything. It does not seek to annihilate something else. It is a still point from where one sees where everything stands. It is a point of emergence. In other words, if we take it back to thought again, that presence is the point from which we see. And the emphasis here is to see. To see is a very, very, very powerful action. To see. And we are already getting a sense of that because when one says to you, I do not feel seen, or I want to be seen, what they're actually saying to you is that seeing is an act of recognition, of acknowledgement, of a deeper knowing. So, from this place of presence that I speak of, this presence that absents nothing, is a point from which we see the limitation of thought. But that limitation is also a movement. In other words, you see the movement of thought. And because we as thinkers have become thought, the challenge now is, can you see the movement of thought? That is now you. You, the thinker, is the thought. But there is another place, a presence that absents nothing, from which one can see the limitation of thoughts, but also its movement. And what is this movement? This movement is all the movement through which thought makes correlation and put things in relation. Now, I want to end this by evoking a saying in my Igbo language. And it loosely translates to this: where one thing stands, something else stands beside it. This is a very powerful saying in my Igbo language. Yeah? Ebe otu ihe kwu, ihe ọzọ kwụ n'akwụkwọ ya. Where one thing stands, something else stands beside it. This is the law of correlation. This is the law of relation. And thought has usefulness within that. But it is important to understand that we are not the thought. That thought is only a tool for this correlation, for seeing truly what stands beside something else. Because where one thing stands, something else stands beside it. So that's it for today. Let me know what you make of this. Leave me a comment in the comment section. Let us think about it. Yes, think about it together. but knowing that you are not your thought, but the thinker becomes the thought. And we are all caught up in this. And the way forward is to enter this process of freeing ourselves from the thick wax of thought. So that's it for today on this episode of Dots of Thoughts. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next one. Bye-bye.